of expanding as they go.
And this is the point, that what we're going to be doing is we're going to be dealing in increments as much as possible, putting together building blocks to give people the entire story so that people have the access to the information in its raw form. For instance, tonight we're going to be relying heavily on an excellent book called The Politics of Heroin in Southeast Asia. That book is by Alfred W. McCoy, and it is currently, I believe, out of print. It is available still in some places, and you can usually find it in libraries. But instead of just popping through it and hitting a couple of paragraphs out of the entire book, we're going to be going into it extensively because it was really the groundbreaking work in this field of talking about the relationship of drugs to power politics. And as a result, what we're going to be doing tonight is really largely concentrating almost entirely on the shift over of the Asian heroin trade into the hands of Western intelligence. We're not going to have any time tonight to talk about cocaine, which is a huge factor. And cocaine in politics is a gigantic issue that we're not even going to be able to tackle this time, which is why, as Dave mentioned, this is a 3 and possibly 4-part series.
We'll be going around the horn, I guess you could say. We're going to be talking at great length. In fact, an entire broadcast will be, an entire Radio Free America show will be devoted to the influence of the CIA and military in promoting LSD. You really literally cannot separate out the military and the CIA from LSD, despite the counterculture overtones that drug acquired in the 60s and 70s. The fact of the matter is, everywhere you look with LSD in its development or use, one finds the military and the intelligence services. So we'll be dealing with I don't know if you could say the entire cornucopia of pharmacology, but we're going to be covering a lot of the so-called recreational drugs that are in use in this society, and we'll show you where the use and abuse originally comes from.
Indeed. And again, the point being that tonight we're going to be concentrating on a very specific step-by-step path of the growth of the heroin trade and the changeover of the heroin trade from something that was initially purely an underworld movement, a criminal movement solely for the purpose of money making, and how it became a political tool. Again, heroin is only one of the drugs we're going to talk about, as Dave mentioned. We've got LSD coming up. We're going to talk about the cocaine trade. We're going to talk about a variety of other things in the upcoming shows. So if you're just tuning in for the first time, if it seems a little slow going to you, as Dave mentioned at the top of the broadcast, we realize that. That's the reason that this show is formatted differently from the broadcasts that we do on Sunday, which tend to be much more fast-moving, which tend to touch on a variety of topics. These are archive broadcasts. They are meant to contain as much information as we can squeeze into 4 hours without killing ourselves, basically. And still being able to make sense, which is important also. And we tend to go very deeply into the source material we use, as again tonight with The Politics of Heroin in Southeast Asia, and a very important book that probably most people out there have never read, and at least this will give them a good, healthy sampling of the work contained in it.
Beyond that, the fact of the matter is that if the issues that we talk about on One Step Beyond, that Mae Brussel talks about on her World Watchers program, also heard on this station, if these issues are going to be dealt with effectively by our society, by the people in our society, obviously people are going to have to know about them. And yet people are up against the limitation of the fact that there are only 168 hours in a week. People have to work, they have to go to school, they have family commitments, and so forth. That's really what our archive shows are aimed at doing, is to give you an in-depth, complete understanding, or as complete as one can get, and also give you hard references. In other words, we're not sitting here asking you to accept our word for things. We're giving you the relevant source material and exerting as much of it as we reasonably can onto tape, so that basically you can acquire a degree of expertise, and yet you won't have to rearrange your lifestyle fundamentally in order to do it. But again, these are very, very important topics that we cover. This is not only one of the most important topics, but it's extremely timely. For those who eventually hear these programs later, this program is being recorded in mid-October of 1986 amidst a rising wave of anti-drug hysteria in this country. Now, needless to say, neither Nip nor myself advocates the use of illegal drugs. That's a decision people should make on their own, and I think make it very carefully, and the dominant consideration should be their own health. However, the fact of the matter is that a lot of these drugs, and friend, as damaging as they are, come from elements of our government, that our government is inextricably linked with the very plague that it is now ostensibly leading the charge against. And it's extremely timely, and again, as Nip indicated, The Politics of Heroin in Southeast Asia is not readily available. It's one of the dominant reference works in this field, and it's not easy to get a hold of. We're going to be exerting long segments of it tonight, many of the key segments. So again, feast your eyes and brains and go for it.
Now, as many of our listeners who have been following these broadcasts before are aware, the drug situation and the stance of our government vis-a-vis drugs is very similar to the stance of our government vis-a-vis terrorism, insofar as if we were going to make a psychiatric comparison, we would call it transference. Transference is when one sees in other people the very illnesses that one has oneself. A classic case is what's been going on lately with Nicaragua, where Nicaragua has been accused by the Reagan administration of being the chief supplier of cocaine in the Western Hemisphere, working with Cuba and the Soviet Union to flood our country with killer cocaine and destroy the moral foundation of our youth, etc., etc. Well, in fact, as those who follow the newspapers, and especially those who follow these broadcasts know, in fact, the overwhelming weight of evidence is on the side showing that the folks, in fact, who are dealing cocaine in the Nicaraguan conflict are the Contras, which, again, is not surprising because, as we will see tonight, the right-wing mercenary/intelligence milieu has been making use of illegal drugs as a source for ready capital for a long time, especially when connected with the illegal arms traffic. And again, what we see in this case is we see the Reagan administration hysterically denouncing communist drug traffickers and decrying the rot of the moral fabric of our country due to drug use, while at the same time it's our very own intelligence establishment, as we will begin to show tonight, that has been for the last 40 years dealing very extensively in illegal drugs themselves. And in fact, that they have been doing this far more than, as far as we can tell, any of the communist countries or otherwise anathematic countries that are constantly cited by our government as examples of governments gone bad or terrorist or drug-dealing governments. So again, we're going to see tonight where this springs directly out of a very, very old program that started in Asia at the time of the Chinese Revolution, actually before the Chinese Revolution during World War II, and has carried on right to this day, this program of using drugs, and this is the main thing here tonight, using drugs not necessarily because of any moral commitment to drugs or because of anything about drugs other than the fact that they move quickly, they reap a great deal of profit for a small amount of actual material moved, that the circles that tend to deal in drugs are already dealing in a lot of other things like arms and things of that nature, and in many cases also in political insurrection. And the fact that they are a very, very good under-the-table source of capital for operations that people like the CIA cannot have bankrolled in the public eye.
It's also worth noting, too, a couple of points. By introducing illegal drugs into a given environment, you are creating a conspiratorial milieu in and of itself, because they are illegal. That often serves as an ideal vehicle for compromising people and subsequently using those people for whatever purposes an intelligence service would like to. Beyond that, it should be noted also, in addition to the situation in Nicaragua, the Afghan freedom fighters, who are receiving the largest support of any group from our intelligence system at the moment, is also very much involved in the narcotics traffic. They have been linked both to large-scale hashish and opium trafficking, and the profits from these are going to finance their war. As we're going to see this evening, and in future Radio Free America shows on the subject, that is a very, very common, almost numbingly familiar pattern, because we're going to be looking at that at great length this evening in Southeast Asia, both before and during the American involvement in the Vietnam War. And
undoubtedly in upcoming broadcasts we will be mentioning, as Dave said, it's a numbingly familiar pattern. It's not only with many, many Southeast Asian governments, such as the Laotian and the Vietnamese and the Chinese, the Taiwanese governments and people of this sort. We've also seen it time and time again in the Middle East with the phalangists that we have been supporting in the Middle East, the phalangist government there, the right-wing government of Turkey, in Italy, in certain political groups that we've supported, in France, in Spain, and all over South and Central America. In short, it's virtually a worldwide phenomenon, and in 9 out of 10 cases, it seems there has been direct intervention by our intelligence service at some point along the route. So stick with us, folks. It's going to be a rather chilling ride, and there's going to be a lot of ups and even more downs, but it's something that if you are concerned about drugs, and this can mean as a parent, as a person themselves who has taken or been exposed to drugs, or just as a concerned citizen who's been hearing all the talk on the news. If you're concerned about drugs, you owe it to yourself to pull your head out of the sand and to find out what's really going on with the politics of drugs and international intelligence.
Now, before we actually get into the history of or the historical background to our intelligence services involvement with the narcotics traffic, we're going to just, by way of introduction, discuss ever so briefly a little bit about the history of heroin, which is the first of the drugs we're going to be considering. Now, it should be noted that it's intriguing that heroin should have become such a scourge in our society, because initially heroin was not only a legal drug, but it specifically was hailed as a miracle drug. It was hailed as a cough suppressant. It was hailed, ironically enough, as a cure for morphine addiction, believe it or not, in its inception. And the actual drug heroin itself was widely regarded. It was initially developed by the Bayer Company, one of the member companies of IG Farben, which we're going to talk about. But when it first came out, and it, I believe, was first developed in 1898, it was literally the subject of a worldwide media advertising blitz by the Bayer Company, and doctors were prescribing it right and left for all kinds of ailments. By the early 20s, it had become apparent that this had created a monstrous addiction problem in the United States and elsewhere, so the drug became illegal at that point. But it should be noted that America's heroin addicts initially became addicted to that drug because it was not only legal, but widely prescribed by the medical community. That's something to think about as you observe a lot of people today becoming addicted to prescription drugs. Perhaps they've had surgery or been injured, and a doctor will prescribe a painkiller, and that painkiller can prove addictive. This, again, is a numbingly familiar pattern. Heroin initially, and this is a significant point, was not only legal but was hailed as a miracle drug and widely prescribed. And this is where the heroin addiction problem first comes from. It should be noted that the problem of heroin addiction was added to morphine addiction and compounded the problem of morphine addiction, and it's worth noting for our purposes that morphine addiction has stemmed largely in this country from wars. Specifically, casualties were treated with morphine in order to dull their pain. Many of the men, and the first large-scale morphine addiction in this country followed the Civil War, and it's worth noting that after our major foreign wars, there has always been an upsurge in drug addiction in this country due to people who were treated with morphine or other drugs and become addicted to it. There was a large swelling of the addict population in the United States immediately after World War I due to the effects of morphine, and then shortly after World War I, the medical community in this country took stock of the fact that heroin was creating a huge addiction problem, and then finally, after being hailed as a miracle drug and widely prescribed, it became illegal. And Nip's going to give you a couple of interesting details about heroin's origin and about the origin of a drug which is used now to treat heroin addiction. And as you listen to what he's reading, remember that initially heroin was prescribed for, among other things, a cure. It was prescribed as a cure for morphine addiction.
This short segment I'm going to read is from a book called The Crime and Punishment of IG Farben. The book is by Joseph Borkin, B-O-R-K-I-N, copyright 1978 by the Free Press, which is a division of Macmillan Publishing Company. An excellent book, by the way, and well worth your time. It gives a very good insight into something that people who are students of history and politics and warfare often do not spend enough time with, which is the economic and industrial basis of war, which is inextricable from the fabric of warfare itself.
Just before Nip reads, the IG Farben, for people who are tuned into us for perhaps for the first time or one of the first times, IG Farben, or the Interessengemeinschaft Farben industry, as its full name is something. It's one of the dominant industrial concerns in the world, and it's something one should really. It's sort of a must to know about if you want to understand the history of industry in the modern world. It basically was a giant chemical cartel, a number of companies that had comprised the heart of the German dye-stuff industry, combined after World War I into one giant cartel, or Interessengemeinschaft, which roughly translates community of interest. This giant chemical cartel, the IG Farben industry, composed of a number of different companies, including the Bayer Company, which Nip is going to read you about, remained as a cartel through the end of World War II, and during the World War II and pre-World War II period, the IG Farben provided the backbone of Hitler's war production. It was the single dominant industrial concern in Nazi Germany, and as one observer of the situation noted, he said that Hitler was Farben and Farben was Hitler. After the war, the cartel was broken up into its member companies, but those member companies remained just as influential on the scene as they were when they were one giant company. It's sort of similar to the way Standard Oil, where the old Standard Oil Trust was busted up into Mobil, Exxon, Chevron, and other companies, but they're still all owned by the Rockefellers, so in a sense the trust busting under Roosevelt was sort of academic. But the IG Farben, a giant chemical cartel, the single most important concern behind the Third Reich.
Also, it should be mentioned that at the end of World War II, several members of the IG Farben board of directors were the first civilians ever found guilty of war crimes, which should give you an idea of how very closely the community of interest was shared between IG Farben and Hitler's Nazi political machine.
And listeners listening to these tapes in the future, if they would like to refer to things dealing with IG Farben, at DAVCOR we have a number of different tapes. First of all, Uncle Sam and the Swastika deals extensively with IG Farben. Our first two Radio Free America shows, looking back from 1984, The Hidden History of the Cold War, Parts 1 and 2, deal with IG Farben at considerable length throughout the broadcasts, and also a program called The Third Reich, South Africa, and the Bomb deals with the role of IG Farben in Nazi Germany's industrial production and also in the nuclear production of post-war Germany, the Federal Republic of Germany. So people would like to read up more on IG, there are some good references.
Now, after all that build-up, it's a very short segment, but it's a very interesting segment nonetheless. Remember, Bayer was part of this interlocking concern, chemical concern, IG Farben. Bayer's pharmaceutical venture was even larger. Out of its laboratories emerged aspirin, the world's most famous home remedy for pain and fever. Bayer was also responsible for the introduction of heroin, which it sold as a cure for morphine addiction and as a cough suppressant, especially effective in children. Later, the Bayer laboratories developed methadone in preparation for World War II as a synthetic substitute for morphine. It was originally named Dolafine, in honor of Adolf Hitler. Today, methadone is used principally in the treatment of heroin addiction. And of course, methadone itself is highly addictive, but actually it's used for one reason, because it's safer and it's cheaper to manufacture than heroin is.
But it's interesting, again, that heroin addiction, initially, of course, heroin prescribed as a cure for morphine addiction, is now being cured by methadone, which was initially a synthetic narcotic produced by IG Farben in case the flow of opium from the East was cut off by the British blockade during World War II, and of course originally named in honor of Adolf Hitler. Well, now we're going to begin dealing with the actual influence of the U.S. intelligence system on the narcotics traffic and its actual involvement in that narcotics traffic. Perhaps the most significant piece of background, of historical background, to understand the involvement of our intelligence services in narcotics trafficking is to understand three wartime alliances made by the U.S. intelligence system, or World War II and immediate post-World War II alliances. Specifically, these alliances were with criminal syndicates which had considerable links to the narcotics trafficking. The first link we're going to look at is an alliance between U.S. Naval Intelligence and the Onorata Società, or Mafia as it's commonly known, the Sicilian Mafia. Following that, we're going to take a look at the involvement of the CIA with the Union Corse, the Corsican syndicate in France immediately after World War II. And later on in the broadcast, we're going to take a look at the involvement of U.S. Naval Intelligence and the OSS, America's wartime World War II intelligence service, with a fellow named Tai Li. He was an not imperial Japanese, he was actually an imperial Chinese, if you want to look at it that way. He was a Kuomintang warlord and the chief intelligence chief and political enforcer, I guess you could say, for Chiang Kai-shek prior to his overthrow by the Chinese communists in 1949. Tai Li was also very much involved with the narcotics trafficking through the Green Gang in Shanghai, as we're going to look at. He formed a very, very interesting alliance with naval intelligence. These three alliances between the U.S. intelligence system and criminal syndicates during and immediately after World War II are essential for understanding the involvement of the U.S. intelligence system with narcotics trafficking. Again, the first of these alliances we're going to be looking at is the U.S. Navy's wartime alliance with the Mafia. Reading now from The Politics of Heroin in Southeast Asia by Alfred W. McCoy. The book was copyrighted in 1972, published in hardcover by Harper & Row. Once again, Alfred McCoy's The Politics of Heroin in Southeast Asia, also assisted by Kathleen B. Reed and Leonard P. Adams. Now, it's worth noting that at the point in the story which we're going to be picking up, well, actually, we're going to look at, the first thing I'm going to read here is a little bit of the overview for the U.S. intelligence system's involvement with the organized crime and its subsequent involvement with the narcotics trafficking. Then we're going to get into the whole question of the CIA and OSS involvement with the Mafia in great detail in just a second. It's worth noting, though, that during World War II, the number of heroin addicts in this country dropped enormously because basically World War II seriously disrupted the international narcotics traffic. A combination of the fact that the sea lanes were much more perilous due, obviously, to the submarine warfare and so forth, the fact that, as a result, merchant shipping bottoms were not as easy to come by, the increased security countries had around their borders, a lot of different factors combined to make it extremely difficult to traffic in heroin internationally. Also, the progress of the warfare itself also disrupted the international heroin trade considerably, as different groups involved in the narcotics trade were forced to migrate or to move very suddenly due to the progress of the warfare. But it's worth noting that during World War II, the heroin supply, the World Heroin Distribution Network, was almost decimated, and the number of heroin addicts in the United States reduced to almost nothing, because had the situation turned out differently, had the U.S. intelligence system not involved itself with these criminal syndicates, it's quite possible that the world heroin problem could have been eliminated at the end of World War II. Reading once again now, returning to, I should say, The Politics of Heroin in Southeast Asia by Alfred McCoy. While law enforcement efforts failed to stem the flow of illicit heroin into the United States during the 1930s, the outbreak of World War II seriously disrupted international drug traffic. Wartime border security measures and a shortage of ordinary commercial shipping made it nearly impossible for traffickers to smuggle heroin into the United States. Distributors augmented dwindling supplies by adulterating heroin with increasingly greater proportions of sugar or quinine. While most packets of heroin sold in the United States were 28% pure in 1938, only 3 years later they were less than 3% pure. As a result of all this, many American addicts were forced to undergo involuntary withdrawal from their habits, and by the end of World War II, the American addict population had dropped to less than 20,000. In fact, as the war drew to a close, there was every reason to believe that the scourge of heroin had finally been purged from the United States. Heroin supplies were non-existent, international criminal syndicates were in disarray, and the addict population was reduced to manageable proportions for the first time in half a century. But the disappearance of heroin addiction from the American scene was not to be. Within several years, in large part thanks to the nature of U.S. foreign policy after World War II, the drug syndicates were back in business, the poppy fields in Southeast Asia started to expand, and heroin refineries multiplied both in Marseille and Hong Kong. How did we come to inflict this heroin plague on ourselves? The answer lies in the history of America's Cold War crusade. World War II shattered the world order much of the globe had known for almost a century. Advancing and retreating armies surged across the face of 3 continents, leaving in their wake a legacy of crumbling empires, devastated national economies, and shattered social orders. In Europe, the defeat of fascist regimes in Germany, Italy, France, and Eastern Europe released workers from years of police state repression. A wave of grassroots militants swept through European labor movements, and trade unions launched a series of spectacular strikes to achieve their economic and political goals. Bled white by 6 years of costly warfare, both the victor and vanquished nations of Europe lacked the means and the will to hold on to their Asian colonial empires. Within a few years after the end of World War II, vigorous national liberation movements swept through Asia from India to Indonesia as indigenous groups rose up against their colonial masters. America's nascent Cold War crusaders viewed these events with undisguised horror. Conservative Republican and Democratic leaders alike felt that the United States should be rewarded for its wartime sacrifices. These men wanted to inherit the world as it had been and had little interest in seeing it changed. Henry Luce, founder of the Time Life Empire, argued that America was the rightful heir to Great Britain's international primacy and heralded the post-war era as, quote, the American century, unquote. To justify their entanglement in foreign adventures, America's Cold Warriors embraced a militantly anti-communist ideology. In their minds, the entire world was locked in a Manichaean struggle between godless communism and the free world, unquote. The Soviet Union was determined to conquer the world, and its leader Joseph Stalin was the new Hitler. European labor movements and Asian nationalist struggles were pawns of international communism, unquote, and as such had to be subverted or destroyed. There could be no compromise with this monolithic evil. Negotiations were appeasement, unquote, and neutralism was immoral, unquote. In this desperate struggle to save Western civilization, unquote, any ally was well welcome and any means was justified. The military dictatorship on Taiwan became Free China, unquote. The police state in South Vietnam was Free Vietnam, unquote. A collection of military dictatorships stretching from Pakistan to Argentina was the free world, unquote. The CIA became the vanguard of America's anti-communist crusade, and it dispatched small numbers of well-financed agents to every corner of the globe to mold local political situations in a fashion compatible with American interests. Practicing a ruthless form of clandestine realpolitik, its agents made alliances with any local group willing and able to stem the flow of communist aggression, unquote. Although these alliances represent only a small fraction of CIA post-war operations, they have nevertheless had a profound impact on the international heroin trade. The Cold War was waged in many parts of the world, but Europe was the most important battleground in the 1940s and 50s. Determined to restrict Soviet influence in Western Europe, American clandestine operatives intervened in the internal politics of Germany, Italy, and France. In Sicily, the forerunner of the CIA, the Office of Strategic Services, formed an alliance with the Sicilian Mafia to limit the political gains of the Italian Communist Party on this impoverished island. In France, the Mediterranean port city of Marseille became a major battleground between the CIA and the French Communist Party during the late 1940s. To tip the balance of power in its favor, the CIA recruited Corsican gangsters to battle communist strikers and backed leading figures in the city's Corsican underworld who were at odds with the local communists. Ironically, both the Sicilian Mafia and the Corsican underworld played a key role in the growth of Europe's post-war heroin traffic and were to provide most of the heroin smuggled into the United States for the next 2 decades. That's by way of introduction, and now, as indicated, Nip's going to begin reading you specifically about the OSS Naval Intelligence Mafia Alliance during and after World War II.
All right, this is also from Alfred McCoy's Politics of Heroin in Southeast Asia. This is headed The Mafia Restored, Fighters for Democracy in World War II. World War II gave the Mafia a new lease on life. In the United States, the Office of Naval Intelligence, ONI, became increasingly concerned over a series of sabotage incidents on the New York waterfront, which culminated with the burning of the French liner Normandie on the eve of its christening as an Allied troopship. Powerless to infiltrate the waterfront itself, the ONI very practically decided to fight fire with fire and contacted Joseph Lanza, Mafia boss of the East Side docks, who agreed to organize effective anti-sabotage surveillance throughout his waterfront territory. When ONI decided to expand Operation Underworld to the West Side docks in 1943, they discovered they would have to deal with the man who controlled them, Lucky Luciano, unhappily languishing in the harsh Dannemora prison. After he promised full cooperation to naval intelligence officers, Luciano was rewarded by being transferred to a less austere state penitentiary near Albany, where he was regularly visited by military officers and underworld leaders such as Meyer Lansky, who had emerged as Luciano's chief assistant. While ONI enabled Luciano to resume active leadership of American organized crime, the Allied invasion of Italy returned the Sicilian Mafia to power. On the night of July 9, 1943, 160,000 Allied troops landed on the extreme southwestern shore of Sicily. After securing a beachhead, General George Patton's U.S. 7th Army launched an offensive into the island's western hills, Italy's Mafia land, and headed for the city of Palermo. Although there were over 60,000 Italian troops and 100 miles of booby-trapped roads between Patton and Palermo, his troops covered the distance in a remarkable 4 days. The Defense Department has never offered any explanation for the remarkable lack of resistance in Patton's race through western Sicily, and pointedly refused to provide any information to Senator Estes Kefauver's Organized Crime Subcommittee in 1951. However, Italian experts on the Sicilian Mafia have never been so reticent. 5 days after the Allies landed in Sicily, an American fighter plane flew over the village of Villalba, about 45 miles north of General Patton's beachhead on the road to Palermo, and jettisoned a canvas sack addressed to Zuccallo. Zuccallo, better known as Don Calogero Vicini, was the unchallenged leader of the Sicilian Mafia and lord of the mountain region through which the American army would be passing. The sack contained a yellow silk scarf emblazoned with a large black L. The L, of course, stood for Lucky Luciano, and silk scarves were a common form of identification used by mafiosi traveling from Sicily to America. It was hardly surprising that Lucky Luciano should be communicating with Don Calogero under such circumstances. Luciano had been born less than 15 miles from Villalba in Lercara Fridi, where his mafiosi relatives still worked for Don Calogero. 2 days later, 3 American tanks rolled into Villalba after driving 30 miles through enemy territory. Don Calogero climbed aboard and spent the next 6 days traveling through western Sicily, organizing support for the advancing American troops. As General Patton's 3rd Division moved onward into Don Calogero's mountain domain, the signs of its dependence on Mafia support were obvious to the local population. The Mafia protected the roads from snipers, arranged enthusiastic welcomes for the advancing troops, and provided guides through the confusing mountain terrain. While the role of the Mafia is little more than a historical footnote to the Allied conquest of Sicily, its cooperation with the American military occupation, otherwise known as AMGOT, was extremely important. Although there is room for speculation about Luciano's precise role in the invasion, there can be little doubt about the relationship between the Mafia and the American military occupation. This alliance developed when, in the summer of 1943, the Allied occupation's primary concern was to release as many of their troops as possible from garrison duties on the island so they could be used in the offensive throughout southern Italy. Practicality was the order of the day, and in October, the Pentagon advised occupation officers, quote, that the Carabinieri, an Italian army, will be found satisfactory for local security purposes, unquote. But the fascist army had long since deserted, and Don Calogero's Mafia seemed far more reliable at guaranteeing public order than Mussolini's powerless Carabinieri. So in July, the Civil Affairs Control Office of the U.S. Army appointed Don Calogero mayor of Villalba. In addition, AMGOT appointed loyal mafiosi as mayors in many of the towns and villages in western Sicily. As Allied forces crawled north through the Italian mainland, American intelligence officers became increasingly upset about the leftward drift of Italian politics. Between late 1943 and mid-1944, the Italian Communist Party's membership had doubled, and in the German-occupied northern half of the country an extremely radical resistance movement was gathering strength. In the winter of 1944, over 500,000 Turin workers shut the factories for 8 days, despite brutal Gestapo repression, and the Italian underground grew to almost 150,000 armed men. Rather than being heartened by the underground's growing strength, the U.S. Army became increasingly concerned about its radical politics and began to cut back its arms drops to the resistance in mid-1944. Quote, more than 20 years ago, Allied military commanders reported in 1944, a similar situation provoked the March on Rome and gave birth to fascism. We must make up our minds, and that quickly, whether we want this second march developing into another ism. Unquote. In Sicily, the decision had already been made. To combat expected communist gains, occupation authorities used Mafia officials in the AMGOT administration. Since any changes in the island's feudal social structure would cost the Mafia money and power, the, quote, honored society was a natural anti-communist ally. So confident was Don Calogero of his importance to AMGOT that he killed Villalba's overly inquisitive police chief to free himself of all restraints. In Naples, one of Luciano's lieutenants, Vito Genovese, was appointed to a position of interpreter liaison officer in American Army headquarters, and quickly became one of AMGOT's most trusted employees. It was a remarkable turnabout. Less than a year before, Genovese had arranged the murder of Carlo Fresca, editor of an anti-fascist Italian-language newspaper in New York, to please the Mussolini government. Genovese and Don Calogero were old friends, and they used their official positions to establish one of the largest black market operations in all of southern Italy. Don Calogero sent enormous truck caravans loaded with all the basic food commodities necessary for the Italian diet, rolling northward to hungry Naples, where their cargoes were distributed by Genovese's organization. All the trucks were issued passes and export papers by the AMGOT administration in Naples and Sicily, and some corrupt American Army officers even made contributions of gasoline and trucks to the operation. In exchange for these favors, Don Calogero became one of the major supporters of the Sicilian independence movement, which was enjoying the covert support of the OSS. As Italy veered to the left in 43 of 44, the American military became alarmed about their future position in the Mediterranean, in Italy, and felt that the island's naval bases and strategic location in the Mediterranean might provide a possible future counterbalance to a communist mainland. Don Calogero supported this separatist movement by recruiting most of western Sicily's mountain bandits for its volunteer army, but quietly abandoned it shortly after the OSS dropped it in 1945. Don Calogero rendered other services to the anti-communist effort by breaking up leftist political rallies. On September 16, 1944, for example, the communist leader Girolamo Licauzi held a rally in Villalba that ended abruptly in a hail of gunfire as Don Calogero's men fired into the crowd and wounded 19 spectators. Michele Pantaleone, who observed the Mafia's revival in his native village of Villalba, described the consequences of Amgot's occupation policies. Quote, "By the beginning of the Second World War, the Mafia was restricted to a few isolated and scattered groups and could have been completely wiped out if the social problems of the island had been dealt with. The Allied occupation and the subsequent slow restoration of democracy reinstated the Mafia with its full powers, put it once more on the way to becoming a political force, and returned to the Onorata Società the weapons which fascism had snatched from it." So before we continue, let's just point out a couple of very key and important things that have already happened. First of all, the American military establishment has already put itself into debt with Lucky Luciano and the Sicilian Mafia. In other words, if we were going to be dramatic about this, or if this were a fairy tale, what they have done here is they have signed the pact with the devil. They have sold their soul to the Mafia. Secondarily, the American military has begun to put mafiosi in positions of power in local villages, and remember, the mafiosa already had a very strong internal structure. So to put them in a position of power was to make sure that very quickly the mafiosi were going to be completely in power. Thirdly, and perhaps most importantly for what we're discussing tonight, the pattern that we have looked at time and time again on all of these Radio Free America broadcasts at the end of World War II shows up, which is the actual resistance, the people who have been fighting to free their country from the fascists in Italy and also the Nazis as well, as happened in Greece, as happened in Vietnam, as happened in many, many other places all over the world. The actual resistance, because the fact that most of the effective resistance came from leftist movements who were well organized, the actual resistance was betrayed by the Western occupiers, and in this case, as you can see, as the resistance began to build up strength, they began stopping the arms drops, cutting them back to prevent them from maintaining power, and instead handed power over to the Mafia. This is a very, very extremely common thing, and we've seen this happen time and time again. And what it is, again, was the effort on the part of the American intelligence and military establishments to shape the post-war world and to keep the leftists out of power whenever possible. Unfortunately, in most of these countries, most of the legitimate middle-of-the-road opposition had been destroyed by the fascist governments. The leftists were anybody who even slightly socialist was too far left for these people in most cases, and so as a result, the people who got the power were in most cases the same fascists who had been cooperating avidly with the Nazis or the Italians or the Japanese.
Right. So again, for the purposes of the discussion here, the sabotage that was in effect, the Axis sabotage on the East Coast docks during World War II leads U.S. naval intelligence to make a deal with the American Mafia to basically use their influence on the docks to eliminate this sabotage. That deal then basically results in the lightening of the sentence of Lucky Luciano, the head of the American Mafia. Luciano, in exchange for his support in helping to eliminate Axis sabotage, is guaranteed freedom after the war. He gets that freedom, and along with many other American mafiosi, is installed in a position of power in Italy. Some American mafia leaders went to Italy and were installed in power, such as Vito Genovese under Amgot. Some of them, such as Don Calogero, were there to begin with. But the point is that it was the American involvement in Sicily which restored the Sicilian Mafia to power. That Sicilian Mafia, under at the point that we're about to resume the discussion, the then deported Lucky Luciano, is one of the dominant elements in restoring the heroin trade, the world heroin trade. Recall that heroin and illicit drug traffic in general was almost brought to a halt by World War II. The Mafia in Italy and Sicily, because Mussolini looked on them as a rival power base, was virtually eliminated. The U.S., via its wartime and post-war alliances, installs the Mafia in Sicily, and as indicated here, the Mafia then duly set about machine gunning various communists and leftists that their American sponsors wanted gotten rid of.
And as we'll see, despite the fact that, as Dave mentioned, Mussolini decided to move his Mafia rivals out of the way during World War II, at the end of World War II, finding themselves both in many cases on the receiving end of OSS and CIA aid money and secret loans and things like that, the Mafia and the fascists began growing back together to cooperate in fighting the quote-unquote communist threat on behalf of their Western intelligence masters.
By the way, this fascist Mafia axis and its involvement in drug trafficking is something we've already looked at in our Mediterranean merry-go-round series about the Pope shooting, specifically in Radio Free America number 20, our program dealing with the Stibom Arms for Drugs ring. We looked at the P2, the Italian fascists' involvement with an arms for drug smuggling ring. We'll be touching back on Stibom later in this series. Returning once again to The Politics of Heroin in Southeast Asia by Alfred McCoy. Now recall, the Sicilian Mafia and Italian Mafia, virtually eliminated by Mussolini, are now back in power stronger than ever due to the influence of the American armies which had landed there and put them back in power as part of the military government and used their assassination and violence expertise to help suppress communism in Italy. It should be also noted, by the way, before we get into Lucky Luciano and his actual role in reorganizing the heroin traffic after World War II, that the very resistance of the communist and socialist groups in Europe to the fascists was one of the things that had made them so powerful. They were both very popular because virtually the only militarily significant resistance in Europe did come from the various communist parties. That in turn made them very popular with the populations of the countries that had been occupied by the German and Italian armies. So it's sort of an ironic situation. This was why the perceived communist threat existed, precisely because the communists were the only ones who stood up to the fascists in the occupied nations for all practical purposes. So again, the American military government using the Mafia both to help secure the East Coast docks and to help get them into Sicily when it was occupied by the Italian fascists and to help them put down the perceived communist threat after the war. The Sicilian Mafia is back in power stronger than ever. It's at this point in 1946 when Lucky Luciano gets deported to Sicily after being freed as per his agreement with naval intelligence. This is where we're going to resume our narrative here. Again, going back to The Politics of Heroin in Southeast Asia by Alfred McCoy. In 1946, American military intelligence made one final gift to the Mafia. They released Luciano from prison and deported him to Italy, thereby freeing the greatest criminal talent of his generation to rebuild the heroin trade. Appealing to the New York State Parole Board in 1945 for his immediate release, Luciano's lawyers based their case on his wartime services to the Navy and Army. Although Navy and naval intelligence officers called to give evidence at the hearings were extremely vague about what they had promised Luciano in exchange for his services, one naval officer wrote a number of confidential letters on Luciano's behalf that were instrumental in securing his release. Within 2 years after Luciano returned to Italy, the U.S. government deported over 100 more mafiosi as well. And with the cooperation of his old friend Don Calogero and with the help of many of his old followers from New York, Luciano was able to build an awesome international narcotics syndicate soon after his arrival in Italy. The narcotics syndicate Luciano organized after World War II remains one of the most remarkable in the history of the traffic. For more than a decade, it moved morphine base from the Middle East to Europe, transformed it into heroin, and then exported it in substantial quantities to the United States, all without ever suffering a major arrest or seizure. The organization's comprehensive distribution network within the United States increased the number of active addicts from an estimated 20,000 at the close of World War II to 60,000 in 1952 and to 150,000 by 1965. After resurrecting the narcotics traffic, Luciano's first problem was securing a reliable supply of heroin. Initially, he relied on diverting legally produced heroin from one of Italy's most respected pharmaceutical companies, Schiaparelli. However, investigations by the U.S. Federal Bureau of Narcotics in 1950, which disclosed that a minimum of 700 kilos of heroin had been diverted to Luciano over a 4-year period, led to a tightening of Italian pharmaceutical regulations. But by this time, Luciano had built up a network of clandestine laboratories in Sicily and Marseille, and no longer needed to divert the Schiaparelli product. Morphine base was now the necessary commodity. Thanks to his contacts in the Middle East, Luciano established a long-term business relationship with a Lebanese who was quickly becoming known as the Middle East's major exporter of morphine base, Sami El-Khoury, E-L-Khoury. Through judicious use of bribes and his high social standing in Beirut society, El-Khoury established an organization of unparalleled political strength. The directors of Beirut Airport, Lebanese Customs, the Lebanese Narcotics Police, and perhaps most importantly, the chief of the anti-subversive section of the Lebanese police, protected the import of raw opium from Turkey's Anatolian plateau into Lebanon, its processing into morphine base, and its final export to the laboratories in Sicily and Marseille.